The men at the co-op laughed when Marisol Vega backed her truck up to the irrigation ditch and started releasing fish into the water. Tilapia, of all things, into a drainage channel meant for crop water, not livestock. One of them filmed it on his phone, just in case it went wrong, just in case it became a story to tell later at the feed store. Marisol didn't look up. She had a clipboard in one hand and a bucket in the other, and she counted the fish as they slipped under the surface, the way another person might count cash. By the third week, the ditch that had been dead for 2 seasons was moving again, and nobody at that co-op was laughing the same way anymore. The land had belonged to her husband's family before it belonged to her, 91 acres outside Brawley, in the Imperial Valley, where the soil was supposed to be some of the richest in the country and had been for 60 years. Marisol was 43. She'd married into farming, not been born into it, and that distinction mattered more in that valley than people liked to admit. Her husband, Refugio, had died 4 years earlier, a heart attack in the cab of a Kubota M7 while he was disking a field in July heat. After that, the land was hers whether anyone agreed with the arrangement or not. She kept it going. Alfalfa, mostly some Sudan grass, a section of melons that never quite paid for itself, but kept the soil resting between alfalfa cuttings. The irrigation ran the old way, gravity-fed through concrete ditches that had been poured in the 1950s, water moving from the canal down through her fields and out the far end into a tailwater drain that fed back toward the Alamo River. It was a system built for a different decade, when water moved slow and the soil could afford to wait. Refugio's father had built the first stretch of that ditch system by hand in 1958, mixing concrete in a wheelbarrow because there hadn't been money for a contractor. Marisol had heard the story so many times by the time she married into the family that she could recite the dates without thinking about them, the way you remember a hymn from childhood without remembering when you learned it. There were photographs in a box in the hall closet, her father-in-law young and lean in a straw hat, standing in a ditch that hadn't yet been poured, and she used to look at them sometimes on nights when the work felt like more than she could carry alone. By the time Refugio died, the ditches were already changing. The water came through thinner, slower, sometimes with a smell that hadn't been there before, something sulfuric and flat. The soil at the field edges had started to crust white, a fine crystalline rim that crept further in every season. Salt. Everyone in the valley knew salt, the way people who live near the ocean know weather. It built in the ground from decades of irrigation, concentrated by evaporation, left behind after the water that carried it moved on. Refugio used to flush it with extra water in winter, the old method, brute force against an old problem. Marisol didn't have his hands or his years on the tractor. What she had was a notebook, a green spiral one she kept in the truck's glove box, and a habit of writing down anything that didn't sit right with her. She'd started at the year before he died, mostly recording yields and dates, nothing scientific. After he was gone, the notebook became something closer to a conversation she was still having with him, line by line, season by season, about what the land was trying to tell her. The county extension agent came out in March, a man named Dale Pruitt who'd been doing soil consultations in the valley for 11 years and had opinions about most things faster than most people had questions. He walked her West 40 with a handheld EC meter, took 4 readings, and told her what she already suspected. Salinity was climbing. Electrical conductivity readings near 6.8 ds/m in the worst patches, well past the threshold where alfalfa roots start losing the fight to pull water against the salt. "You're looking at leaching," he said. "Flush it heavy in the off-season, maybe twice what your husband was doing. That's the fix. That's always been the fix." Marisol asked him what would happen to the drain water after it left her property carrying twice the salt load. He said that wasn't really his department, that the drain fed the river, that the river had been handling agricultural runoff for 100 years and would keep handling it. He had 4 more properties to see that day. He wrote his recommendation on a county form, shook her hand, and left before she'd finished her second question. Continental Trust held the note on her equipment loan, and the loan officer, a younger man named Stephen Achterberg, called 2 weeks later about the renewal. He'd seen Pruitt's report. He told her the bank would want to see a leaching plan on file before they extended terms for fall. Said it almost kindly, the way people deliver bad news when they've decided in advance it isn't really their fault. Marisol asked him if the bank accounted for the cost of the extra water, the extra pumping, against what the field would actually yield once the salt came back the following year, because in her experience, it always came back. He said that was outside the scope of what he could discuss on the loan. Nobody she spoke to was cruel about it. They were simply certain, and their certainty moved faster than her questions did. She didn't argue with Pruitt or with Achterberg. She went back to the ditch instead. For 3 weeks that spring, Marisol walked the length of the tailwater drain most mornings before the heat came up, the green notebook in her jacket pocket, a 5-gallon bucket, and a turkey baster she used for collecting water samples hanging off the side of the four-wheeler. She wasn't trained in any of it. She'd watched videos at night after the kids were in bed, university extension talks out of UC Davis and Texas A&M, anything that mentioned salinity, drainage, or biological remediation. Most of it didn't apply directly. Some of it stuck. The first thing she wrote down in the 3rd week of March was that the worst salt crusting wasn't where the water moved slowest, like she'd expected. It was where the water sat stagnant in 3 low pockets along the ditch, places where the old concrete had settled and cracked, where flow nearly stopped before pooling out toward the drain. Pruitt had walked the same stretch with his meter and never noted the pattern, because he'd taken his 4 readings from accessible points along the bank, not from the dead pockets themselves. She marked all 3 pockets with stakes and a number, and she started testing them separately from the rest of the ditch. The second thing came in April. She noticed that algae bloomed thick and green in those same stagnant pockets within days of any warm stretch, and that the bloom seemed to track almost exactly with rising ammonia readings on the cheap aquarium test strips she'd started buying by the box from a feed store 2 towns over. Nobody used aquarium strips on a farm. She used them because they were what she could afford and what she understood, and because an old conversation with her sister, who kept a backyard fish pond in Texas, had planted an idea she couldn't shake. That water choked with algae and nitrogen wasn't dead water. It was water with too much food and nothing eating it. The 3rd discovery in early May was the one that mattered most, though she didn't know it yet. She'd been reading about aquaponics, almost by accident, after a late-night search that started with salinity and somehow ended on small-scale tilapia farming in Egypt's Nile Delta, where farmers had used fish ponds adjacent to irrigation systems for generations. The fish waste feeding the soil microbiology, the fish themselves grazing the algae that choked oxygen from the water. Tilapia tolerated brackish water better than almost any other freshwater species, better even than catfish in some of what she read. They were hardy, cheap, and they ate algae the way her cattle ate alfalfa. She wrote 3 words in the notebook that night, underlined twice. The fish work the water. She didn't tell Pruitt. She didn't tell Achterberg. She drove 90 minutes to a hatchery near El Centro and bought 400 tilapia fingerlings for $312, paid in cash, and told the hatchery owner she was stocking a private pond, which wasn't exactly a lie. Before she released a single fish, she measured the 3 pockets one more time, baseline numbers she copied twice into the notebook in case the truck's glove box ever got wet. Pocket 1 ran 7.1 ds/m. Pocket 2, the worst of them, ran 7.6. Pocket 3, closer to the field outlet, ran 6.4. She wrote the date next to each figure, May 11th, and underneath it she wrote down what she didn't have any business knowing yet, but believed anyway, that the numbers would move and that nobody else in the valley would be watching closely enough to see it happen in real time. By June, the situation on the rest of the property had gotten harder to ignore. The alfalfa on the West 40 came in thin, the 3rd cutting yielding barely 60% of what the field had produced 2 years before. Pruitt's leaching recommendation was costing her real money. She was running close to 40% more irrigation water through the system than the year prior, which meant more pumping hours on the well, more diesel for the pump motor, and a noticeably higher water bill from the irrigation district. The extra flushing wasn't reversing the salinity. It was, if anything, pushing the problem downstream faster, concentrating it in the same dead pockets she'd already mapped. Achterberg called again in July, more pressing this time, mentioning that the bank's risk department had flagged the property based on declining yield reports cross-referenced with the soil data Pruitt had filed. He used the word concerning twice in one phone call. He didn't threaten anything outright. He didn't need to. The Continental Trust note on her equipment was $86,400, and the renewal language gave the bank room to reassess terms if yield projections kept sliding. Meanwhile, in the 3 stagnant pockets where she'd released the tilapia in May, something had started shifting that nobody but Marisol was tracking. The algae blooms that used to choke those pockets green by every warm afternoon had thinned out almost entirely by July. The water moved with a different clarity, not clean exactly, but alive in a way it hadn't been. She measured the dissolved oxygen with a meter she'd borrowed from a neighbor who ran a small catfish operation 2 farms over, and the readings had climbed steadily, week over week, in exactly the pockets where the fish were working. She kept this to herself. Pruitt drove past the property twice that summer and never once looked at the ditch itself, only at the field yields, which are the numbers everyone with authority over her loan actually cared about. The fish weren't visible from the road. The notebook stayed in her jacket. She knew, the way you know a thing before you can prove it, that what she was watching mattered more than what anyone else was measuring, but she also knew that knowing wasn't the same as having an answer yet. There was a moment in late July when she almost lost her nerve. A predator, likely a heron, had picked off a third of the tilapia in pocket 2 within 4 days, and she stood at the bank one evening counting carcasses, wondering if she'd spent $312 and 3 months chasing something that would simply die off before it proved anything. She wrote that night, "Not sure this works. Doing it anyway." Then she went to the hardware store and bought netting. The reveal came in September, almost by accident, at a meeting nobody had planned as a reveal at all. The Irrigation District called a quarterly meeting for landowners along that stretch of drain, mostly to discuss a proposed assessment for emergency desalination infrastructure, a project estimated at $1.4 million to be split among 40-some property owners, which would have put Marisol's share somewhere near $19,000. Money she didn't have, and the bank had made clear it wouldn't lend against the declining property. Pruitt presented first his salinity data from the spring, his recommendation for continued heavy leaching across the district, his case for why the desalination project was necessary district-wide. Then the district's water quality technician, a younger woman named Priya Nair, whom Marisol had never met, presented her own seasonal readings, taken from sampling stations along the drain, including, without either of them knowing it in advance, the exact stretch running through Marisol's property. Nair's data showed something nobody in the room expected. Across most of the district's drain system, conductivity had risen through the summer, consistent with Pruitt's projections. But one stretch, roughly 400 meters, showed a measurable decline. Conductivity readings dropping from 6.8 down to 4.9 ds/m between May and September, and dissolved oxygen levels nearly double the district average. Nair said she'd assumed it was a sensor error and had flagged the station for recalibration. Marisol raised her hand. She didn't make a speech. She said quietly that the stretch in question ran through her property and that she'd put tilapia in 3 stagnant pockets along that ditch back in May, and that she had a notebook with dates and readings if anyone wanted to look at it. The room went silent in a way rooms rarely do at Irrigation District meetings. Pruitt looked at the map, then at her, and didn't say anything for a long moment. Nair asked to see the notebook. The financial contrast came out over the following weeks, once Nair walked the site herself. The district's emergency desalination project, scaled to the full system, would have cost an estimated $1.4 million. Marisol's fish, netting, and 3 months of her own labor had cost $312 plus maybe 60 hours of early mornings. Her actual out-of-pocket cost for what amounted to a working pilot of biological remediation was, by Nair's later estimate, under $500. Nobody clapped. Nobody apologized directly. Pruitt simply said, looking at the notebook rather than at Marisol, that he'd want to see another full season of data before changing any official recommendation. It was the kind of caution that wasn't wrong, exactly, only careful in a way that arrived 4 months too late to have helped her that summer. Word moved through the valley the way it does in farm country, slow and sideways, through feed store conversations and irrigation district newsletters rather than anything dramatic. By October, 2 neighboring landowners had asked Marisol where she'd bought her fingerlings. She told them, plainly, the same hatchery near El Centro, the same price, $312 for 400 fish, nothing dressed up about it. Nair came back twice more that fall, taking her own samples, building what she eventually called a small case study for the district's annual water quality report. 3 paragraphs buried on page 11, citing anecdotal but measurable improvement in localized salinity through aquatic biological activity. Marisol's name appeared once in a footnote. Achterberg called again in November, this time about the loan renewal, and the tone had shifted without him ever directly acknowledging why. The risk flag had been lifted. He didn't mention the tilapia. He didn't need to. Nair's data had already done that work inside the bank's file, quietly, the way most corrections happen. Marisol didn't bring it up at the co-op. The man who'd filmed her that first day never showed her the video, and she never asked to see it. She kept walking the ditch most mornings, notebook in her jacket, watching the 3 pockets that had taught her more than any consultant had. By winter, she'd added 2 more pockets further down the drain, just to see. The alfalfa came back slow, not miraculous, just steadier than it had been. The 3rd cutting in the following spring landing closer to historical averages than it had in 3 years. She didn't credit the fish for all of it. She credited them for what she'd actually watched them do, which felt like enough. If you're watching this from a place where the water doesn't always do what it's supposed to, where the soil holds on to things long after the season's moved on, you already know the kind of patience this story took. Hit subscribe if you're watching from farm country, anywhere the work happens quiet and slow, mostly unseen until it isn't. We tell these stories because somebody usually noticed something first, long before anyone official wrote it down. The notebook is still in the glove box of that truck, for years of entries now, most of them small. Water levels, weather, a line here and there about a heron, or a neighbor's question, or nothing at all, just a date and a number that mattered only to her. Nobody reads it but Marisol, and that was never really the point of keeping it. There's a particular kind of knowledge that doesn't come from a meter or a county report, the kind that only shows up to people willing to walk the same ground every morning until the ground starts telling them something. Pruitt wasn't wrong about salt. He was only working from readings taken at a distance, the kind of distance that official knowledge tends to keep from the thing it's measuring. Marisol's advantage was never expertise. It was proximity and the willingness to be wrong in private for months before she was right in public. The ditch still runs the old way, gravity-fed, concrete poured in the 1950s, water moving the same direction it always has. What's different now is smaller than people expect, easy to miss if you're driving past at 35 miles an hour. A little more color in the water where the fish work. A little less crust at the field's edge. Nothing that would make a film crew stop. Nothing that resembles the version of farming people picture when they picture struggle and rescue in the same frame. Refugio used to say the land tells you what it needs if you're patient enough to listen for it. And Marisol used to think that was just something men in that valley said to sound like they understood more than they did. She thinks differently now, not because of anything dramatic, but because of 3 stagnant pockets of water and 400 fish that cost less than a single tank of diesel. The land told her. She just happened to be the one standing close enough, notebook in hand, to write it down.